Um, Hello, everyone. I'm Sarah Cassie Burnett, and I am the host for today's Girls Talk Math event, our workshop Impostered by the System with Blake O'Neill Turner and Kristyn Lue. Before I start, I want to say a few words about our program. Girls Talk Math is a free math and media camp for high schoolers who identify as female or non-gender conforming. The program was founded in 2016 by Katrin Morgan and Francesca Bernardi when they were graduate students at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. As a former UNC undergrad, I established a sister chapter here at the University of Maryland as a now graduate student here at the University of Maryland. So this year, Girls Talk Math is holding an online program with 60 students local to UNC, UMD, the University of Minnesota, and the University of California, Los Angeles campuses. We meet twice a week to learn math topics such as knot theory, RSA cryptography, and patterns and fractals. On weekends, we're holding 4 free public events. Today is the second of the series. To learn more, visit girlstalkmath.com and click on the 2020 public events link. All right, so now let's return to our workshop. Last year, we had Kristyn Lue, who is a doctorate student at the Center for Math Education here at the University of Maryland. Prior to that, she got her master's in higher education at the University of Maryland and her bachelor's in applied math at Berkeley. So she gave a talk last year. This year, we're grateful to additionally have Blake O'Neill Turner. Blake's a mathematics educator and doctorate student studying minority and urban education with a concentration in math. She also got her master's in higher education from the University of Illinois, Chicago, as well as her bachelor's in psychology and master's of arts in teaching mathematics at Xavier University of Louisiana. Today I look forward to listening and learning about your research on systemic and societal barriers faced by students, particularly women of color, pursuing STEM degrees, and what students and educators can do to help. So I'll let you take it from here. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Sarah. We appreciate that introduction. And we are excited to be here with Girls Talk Math. As Sarah said, my name is Kristyn Lue, and I'm here today with my friend and colleague, Blake O'Neill Turner. And we are really excited to be here to present our talk, Impostered by the System. Before we get started, I wanted to quickly say that there are actually 2 different ways to spell imposter. So the way that we have it here on the screen, where it's impost-O-R, and then the way you probably saw it spelled in our abstract and then the promotional materials with E-R at the end. Both of them are commonly accepted and correct versions of the spelling, but just for the sake of consistency with some of the quotes that we pulled and cited in this slide deck, we're going to use the OR spelling. So we just wanted to acknowledge that there is a discrepancy between what you'll see in our slide deck and what you will see in the other materials, but you know, both of them are correct ways to spell the word. So moving on. As I mentioned, my name is Kristyn, and as Sarah said, I'm a doctoral student at the Center for Math Education here at the University of Maryland, College Park. And I'm here with Blake, who is also a doctoral student, and she is in the Minority and Urban Education program with a concentration in math education. So that's a little bit about who we are.
Yeah. And so as critical scholars interested in mathematics, Kristyn and I are both interested in what it means to be doers and learners in mathematics. Researchers have demonstrated that mathematics is a racialized space. And so therefore the learning of mathematics is also a racialized space where people are socialized. And so one of our research aims is just to gain a better understanding of how race and math identity intersect. Mathematics and mathematics education does not occur in a vacuum. It's housed within larger systems and structures. And so Kristyn and I are also interested in how systemic and structural inequalities impact mathematics and mathematics education. Specifically, we research how mathematics functions as a white institutional space, and we challenge anti-Black racism in education more broadly.
So we also provided a couple of helpful framing readings. And so we wanted to just give a brief overview of some of those that we had posted. And if you didn't get a chance to read them before today's talk, that's completely okay. We will have a chance to chat more about these on Tuesday if you're one of the campers. But we think that these pieces by some critical math education scholars provide a really helpful and digestible framing for some of the topics that we'll cover today. So the first was an article by Dr. Ebony McGee, whose article for BBC titled, "How Do U.S. Black Students Perform at School?" discusses how we conflate race and ability on an individual level when really we should be considering some of the structural and societal contexts. The second article is an interview that Dr. Julia M. Aguirre conducted with Dr. Danny Martin. And in this article, they talk about racial justice and equity in mathematics. And while they discuss some of the challenges and oppressive foundations of math education, they also discuss phenomena such as radical dreaming, fundamental humanizing, and agency. And then the third piece is an article that I wrote for New America about the influences of classroom culture and identity, sense of belonging, and constructions of STEM and math identity. So again, while many of these themes that are talked about in these readings will come up during our talk, it's completely okay if you haven't had a chance to read them yet. And again, we'll have a chance to talk more about them on Tuesday.
So we're really excited to share this talk and our research interests with you. So for today's talk, we're going to define the who, what, where, when, and why of imposter syndrome. Then we're going to pivot and reframe imposter syndrome as products of a larger structural and systemic inequalities that lead to imposterism. And finally, we're going to conclude with recommendations for both the campers and stakeholders so that we can all take part in dismantling the causes things that cause individuals to feel impostered by the system.
So to start off, what is imposter syndrome exactly? So imposter syndrome is a phenomenon that was first named in the 1970s to describe how accomplished women felt that their successes were due to luck instead of hard work or skill. And it's a pretty commonly used term nowadays. And as Dr. Ebony McGee succinctly puts it, imposter syndrome involves an anxiety that others have mistakenly overestimated one's talents or abilities, and at any moment will realize that they have been duped. So we want to go over some concrete examples of what imposter syndrome might sound like. So maybe you've heard your thoughts like kind of turn here, or you've heard other people say this. But one way that it can sound is, I don't belong here. You know, any minute I'm going to get found out. And this is related to that anxiety that Dr. McGee had mentioned about how, you know, maybe other people, you're worried that other people are going to find out that you have somehow duped them. Another example is, I have to do everything perfectly or they'll know I'm not good enough. So with imposter syndrome, there's often a pressure to perform at a level of perfection because you feel deep down that you're not worthy, and therefore you feel like you constantly have to prove yourself. A third example is, everyone else is way more smart and successful. Why did they let me in? And with imposter syndrome, there can often be a heavy comparison to everyone else around you. And as a final example, sometimes you may think, I feel like such a fraud. I must have somehow tricked everyone. You may not know how, but somehow you did it. So again, there's this anxiety that you're not good enough and that at any minute, everybody else is going to find out. And so these are some examples of what imposter syndrome can sound like. And we wanted to mention as well that while imposter syndrome can happen in a variety of different spaces, I mean, Blake and I still experience this as graduate students, we are particularly focused in our research and in this talk today on how it manifests in STEM spaces. So why do these thoughts happen exactly? Well, one of the reasons that thoughts of imposter syndrome can happen is because of representation, or rather a lack of representation. It can be really hard to feel like you belong in a space if no one else or very few people look like you. And this does happen for women in STEM. So we're going to take a look at some numbers here. If we look at all bachelor's degrees awarded in 2016, we find that women make up 57.3% of that total. But they only make up 42.4% of math and statistics degrees, 20.9% of engineering degrees, 18.7% of computer science degrees, and 39.1% of degrees in the physical sciences. What happens if we just look at women of color? So for the purposes of this chart, women of color are going to be aggregated or put together as Black, Latinx, Native American, Alaskan Native, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, Asian, and multiracial women. So they're already underrepresented in higher education, where they make up 19.6% of bachelor degree recipients in 2016. So we're already starting from a place of underrepresentation, just in higher education as a whole. And when we look at the STEM fields that I had mentioned previously, we see that only 11.3% of math and statistics degrees are earned by women of color, 6.9% of engineering degrees, 7.8% of computer science degrees, and 13.3% of physical science degrees. So not only are women of color underrepresented in higher education, they're also even more so underrepresented in these STEM fields. Okay, let's disaggregate a little bit more, because when we consider women of color, we should also consider the fact that Asian women are, when considered as a monolith, overrepresented in higher education, as well as in math and statistics and the physical sciences, which you can see here in this graph. And when I say monolith, what I mean is that we tend to group all Asians together when we collect data, which negates economic and geographic diversity. But we'll talk more about that later. So as you can see here on this graph, Black, Latinx, and Indigenous women, defined in this case as Native American, Alaskan Native, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander women, are extremely underrepresented in these STEM fields. The numbers get even smaller when we look at predominantly or historically white institutions, right? So an example of this is that nearly a quarter of all Black STEM degree holders graduate from historically Black colleges and universities, which only make up 3% of American colleges and universities. So the numbers that you see here, there's an even bigger discrepancy if we're looking at predominantly or historically white institutions. All this is to say that underrepresentation can really be a reason why imposter syndrome occurs. A second reason that imposter syndrome might occur is stereotype threat. So stereotype threat is the risk of believing and conforming to negative stereotypes based on a social identity such as gender and race. This can affect everyone and can happen for a lot of different identities, but stereotype threat is particularly salient when these identities are highlighted in certain spaces like STEM and mathematics. And in fact, stereotype threat originated as a named phenomenon due to stereotypes in the 1990s about women being worse at math than STEM. So Claude Steele and his colleagues found that women did worse than men on math exams if they were primed beforehand by being told that women tended to do worse on that given exam. So Steele and his colleagues also found out that stereotype threat negatively affected Black students. And while many of these formative studies were conducted in the 1990s, the stereotypes and new versions of them still exist today and can contribute to imposter syndrome as well as performance in these STEM spaces. So a third reason that imposter syndrome might occur and connected to stereotype threat is our conceptions of math people. And so I know I'm kind of talking to a void here. I'm going to pretend there are people out here in front of me. You know, like how many of you have heard this phrase, math people, or used it to describe yourself? Like you may have said like, oh yeah, I'm a math person, or I'm really not a math person at all. Numbers just don't make sense to me. Well, one of the problems with this phrase is that when we narrow down our conceptions of what it means to be a math person or a science person or what it means to be good at STEM, is that a lot of people get left out or may not see themselves as being able to fit into these notions. So I'd like to take a moment to look at some data from the presentation last year that Sarah mentioned that I got to give at this camp back pre-COVID when we were all in person. We used a polling software. So I asked the campers last year, what adjective would you use to describe people who were good at or successful in math? And these were the results. So the most popular word was smart, and we see words like dedicated and determined, but we also see a lot of synonyms for smart up there. So we see intellectual, we see intelligent, inspired, we see talented. So I then asked the girls, mind you, at this math camp, what adjectives they would use to describe themselves. And these were the results of that. There were a lot of wonderful words, a lot of great things that the campers were using to describe themselves. Hardworking is one of the top ones. But we also don't see a huge amount of overlap between these two word clouds, right? And in fact, a study by Leslie Bian and her colleagues at the beginning of 2018 found that by the age of 6 years old, young girls had already begun to associate brilliance and natural intelligence, these words that are associated here on the left with math, with young boys, while traits like hardworking and determined were associated with girls. And so we see this, right, in these word clouds. And all these girls are at a math camp and we're working through math problems that I didn't even get to as an undergraduate math major, right? Like they're working on math that is at and beyond the undergraduate level. And sure enough, when I asked my next question, which is if they considered themselves a math person, a good proportion of them said no. So again, at this math camp, working on advanced mathematical concepts, over a third of these campers said that they didn't consider themselves math people. So something's going on here. All right, so at this point, you may be thinking, okay, this is great. I kind of understand what you're talking about, but it also seems like it's all in people's head. Like I totally see the reasons why imposter syndrome might happen, but can't people just like change their mindsets and like get over it? Like, can't they just fix that themselves?
So as we stated earlier, Kristyn and I are interested in system and structural issues that reproduce inequalities. And as Kristyn has shown us, imposter syndrome is not just simply a matter of changing our thought patterns, that there is something going on in STEM spaces that is causing individuals to feel like imposters. And we think this quote by Natalie Oa can help us to begin to reframe how we conceptualize imposter syndrome and understand that it's not just an individual level phenomenon, but begin to understand how our feelings of imposterism means that the system is actually working how it was designed. So Ola states the seemingly medical nature of the term imposter syndrome is also problematic, suggesting a psychological shortcoming on the part of those who suffer from it. But far from being the product of a pathology, what seems more likely is that imposter syndrome is a rather natural reaction of anyone from a working class, disadvantaged, or minority background to the various biases they face on a daily basis. So what this is saying is that we need to shift our thinking about imposter syndrome as something that the individual needs to change, and rather begin to problematize or challenge the macro and microaggressions that marginalized and minoritized women are facing on a daily basis that is manifesting as imposterism. Macroaggressions include the model myth minority or the myth of meritocracy that's then used as a justification for providing less opportunities to women and people of color in math and STEM spaces. Microaggressions include things like asking a student of color if they got into college because of their athletic ability, or asking if they're a student athlete. Or it might be a teacher only calling on white or Asian students to answer higher order mathematics questions, or just asking a student of color just to fill a diversity spot. Imposterism is the symptom, but anti-Black racism, whiteness, and white supremacy is the cause. And we're going to get into those in a little bit later in our presentation. So now we're going to discuss how shifting how we frame imposter syndrome really is painting a more accurate description of what is actually occurring and how we can begin to navigate it. So you may be asking, well, if imposter syndrome and imposterism are both just about individuals feeling inadequate, how are they different? So while imposter syndrome and imposterism are sometimes conflated, Ebony McGee, she's a STEM education researcher and one of the authors we read in the pre-reading, argues that we need to challenge interventions that propose that students are responsible for their own feelings of imposterism while ignoring deliberate institutional structures and practices that allow imposterism to thrive. So while imposterism focuses solely on the individual, a shift to imposterism acknowledges that there's systems and structures that implicitly and explicitly are creating a culture where women, and especially women of color, are marginalized and made to feel like they're imposters. And so without acknowledging these systems and structures, the blame and the onus to fix the problem becomes the responsibility of the individual rather than the responsibility of the collective. So by focusing only on imposter syndrome, people who perpetuate harmful cultures can say, well, that's your problem and not mine. And so now let's talk a little bit about like, what does imposter syndrome sound like? So we've talked about what imposter syndrome sounds like. Let's talk about what imposterism sounds like. And so imposterism sounds like girls just don't like STEM as much as boys, or they lack the confidence to pursue it. And so we actually took this quote from a news article that talked about girls lacking confidence in pursuing high-paid careers in STEM and technology because they had a lack of confidence. And so again, it puts the onus on the girls to fix their confidence issues and not on why we have a culture that would produce a lack of confidence in young girls. Imposterism can sound like, well, we have a math club, but it's all boys. I don't think you'll feel comfortable. And so this goes back to what Kristyn was talking about earlier, and how lack of representation can have individuals feel like they're isolated. And so we don't want to assume that people just won't feel comfortable. We want to work on changing these places so that everyone feels comfortable within them. Imposterism sounds like, well, can't you just get the name of and insert any male peer to check your work just to be sure it's correct? And so imposterism feels like constantly being discounted or having to prove your worth. And finally, imposterism can sound like, wow, you like math? That's really impressive for a woman. You must be smart. And so going back to what Kristyn said earlier, if we have these really narrowly defined conceptualizations of what a math person is, it essentially creates a space where people are not part of that membership. And so we don't want to continue to equate intelligence and mathematics together. So now let's turn to discuss what the function of imposterism is. So imposterism is not just this big bad boogeyman that just happens by chance. There is a reason that this exists. First, it ensures that we push for change on an individual level and not at an institutional level. So the systems and structures that reproduce and produce imposterism can continue to operate without critical reflection. While it is hard to change larger systems and structures, if we only focus on change at the individual level, it diverts our attention and energy away from making the larger societal and institutional changes. And because less of our energy is being directed towards dismantling certain systems, change then becomes slow, which gives the systems time to mutate to protect and maintain the status quo. So again, the system is shifting blame so that there's no specific person, policy, or institution that can be held liable for the normalization and dehumanization of individuals in mathematics and STEM spaces.
So let's talk really quickly about the status quo. So what is it? The status quo has a lot to do with power consolidation and maintaining who has power and prestige, right? So imposterism actually helps keep that power and prestige consolidated by making math and STEM seem like really elite fields. So you may have heard that STEM degrees are better than liberal arts degrees or humanities degrees, and they're more difficult majors. Or maybe you've heard that people who are interested in STEM and who are good at math are smarter than other people. We have feelings about that. And to be fair, part of this is tied up with the economic value of STEM jobs, right? So on average, STEM occupations earn close to $90,000 a year, while non-STEM jobs earn a little bit more than half of that. On top of that, 93% of STEM occupations earn above the national average, and the United States is currently facing a STEM workforce shortage. So if you have a STEM degree, you're more likely to make more money and you're more likely to get a job in your field. And that's a part of the reason why there's so much like economic value that is tied to this sort of elitism. So again, the economic power in STEM drives that elitism. But then who holds this economic power? So we're going to go back to those graphs again. And if you take another look at this graph, which shows you the proportion of bachelor's degrees awarded in 2016 to white men, white women, and women of color, we can see that white men are way overrepresented in the STEM fields. They make up nearly half of all engineering and computer science degree recipients, despite making up only a quarter of bachelor degree holders from all fields. So why are there so many white men in STEM? And why might this be a problem? Because some people will say that it isn't. They'll say that a lot of it is about who's naturally drawn to STEM, or you're like, that's just how people's brains work, or like, why does it matter that these numbers aren't even? Like maybe that's just how people are drawn. But saying things like that negates a lot of the history that is tied up in this representation, especially when we remember that the people who have existed in these fields and the people who have ran colleges and universities have historically excluded women and people of color from these fields. Desegregation in college only started happening, well, in our schools in general, in the last 60 to 70 years. And there are a lot of states like Maryland who are still going through legal battles to desegregate their university systems. So it's kind of silly for us to think that after only a couple of decades of incremental policies, racism and sexism are suddenly solved, and that if the numbers aren't even, that's just how people's brains work, and it's just due to personal preference. But some people will still say that. And this becomes a problem when we start to conflate these fields with being smarter, being better, and being deserving of these higher salaries and money, especially when we look at who is overrepresented in these fields. So we then start to think cyclically, oh, well, if the STEM fields are full of smarter people and it's mostly white men, then white men must innately be smarter. So George Lipsitz calls this a possessive investment in whiteness. And as he says, race is a cultural construct, but one with deadly social causes and consequences. Conscious and deliberate actions have institutionalized group identity in the United States, not just through dissemination of cultural stories, but also through the creation of social structures that generate economic advantage for European Americans through the possessive investment in whiteness. And today, we see this in the way that we frame the STEM fields and frame math people in saying that they're smarter and better. In doing so, we're reinforcing this association between whiteness and superiority. Okay, so I know it's really hard to think about those things. And it's hard to think about the ways in which mathematics as a field perpetuates these associations when it probably shouldn't. But one of the reasons that whiteness exists, and the reason that math and STEM have been used to reinforce it, is because we really like hierarchies and categories. And sometimes it seems that maintaining those and preserving what math is and who math people are becomes more important than sharing the beauty of math, engaging in these ideas, and recognizing brilliance. So we want to take a moment to talk a bit about how this reinforcement happens in real life, using a recent example from Twitter. So recently there was a viral moment on math Twitter and math education Twitter about this mathematical equality, 2 + 2 = 4. So let's take a moment to think about this. Is it true? Well, you're probably sitting there like, what? Yeah, I learned that in kindergarten. Like, yes, 2 + 2 = 4. And on one hand, yes. Because of the way we define addition and how we define numbers and quantities in base 10, we pretty much can all widely accept that 2 + 2 = 4. But is this always true? Well, not necessarily. If we think about bases, like in binary or base 2, none of these numbers even exist as quantities. In base 3, 2 + 2 = 11, or 1, 1, with a 1 in the 3's place and a 1 in the 1's place. So that's an example of how 2 + 2 might not always equal 4, depending on the context. But when we read this number sentence, we generally agree that we are in the base 10 system and using addition the way that we all learned in elementary school. Let's take a look at another example from a math professor at Portland State University. So she says that context matters always. 2 + 2 = 4 is a statement that works in our base 10 numeration system as long as what we are adding refers to the same type of thing. That's a super cool concept, right? Like 2 dogs and 2 cats is 4 animals, but it's not 4 cats and it's not 4 dogs. That's so cool, right? It's an interesting way of thinking about and questioning some of our basic assumptions about math. But this also made a lot of people on Twitter really, really mad. And this whole thing started because a doctoral student and math teacher said that there isn't anything innately true with a capital T about this statement, right? There's nothing like divine about the idea that 2 + 2 = 4. It's actually something that we've just culturally agreed on. And the reason that we kind of widely accept what these quantities mean and how we add them together and how this agreement came to be about has to do with colonization and imperialism. So to unpack that a little bit more, throughout history, a lot of different civilizations and cultures use different base systems and different conceptions of numbers and different mathematical practices. So even though we have a generally agreed on conception of arithmetic today, that wasn't always the case all around the world, right? But that didn't mean that math didn't work in other cultures, right? It still did. But some people now look at this agreement, like the way that we think about math, this 2 + 2 = 4 thing, as law and order, right? And that's like quoted, like, no, math is about law and order, as if there's something divine and absolutely truthful about it in our interpretations of it. But that's not really what math is about. Math is about taking a very messy and complex world and universe and trying to make some sort of sense of it. And we do that in a lot of different ways. And sometimes in making sense of it, we come up with new branches of math or new concepts. So one of my favorite stories from my math degree in undergrad is my senior year, I was in this complex analysis class. And complex numbers are numbers that have a real component and then an imaginary component. So you may know that term as I. So my professor explained that for a really long time, there was this like branch of mathematical work that just, it wasn't really working out with, like, their equations weren't really working with the tools that they had. And mathematicians were like, oh no, if only there was this number that equaled the square root of -1, everything would be perfect and solved and all this math would work. And then, it doesn't exist. It's terrible. Then they were like, oh, well, we can do that. So they did. And now we have this branch of math that involves complex numbers. But again, as we've been kind of saying, there are some people that really latch onto this idea of law and order and innate truth. And they find a lot of comfort in thinking about math this way and will get angry trying to defend it. We actually received a lot of pushback on our talk today. And again, people will get angry trying to defend it as something that's universal and neutral, that is able to and that we should use to categorize people because it's this elite field that just makes sense. And a lot of that is enmeshed in whiteness. Okay, so at this point, you may be wondering, hold on, what is whiteness? Can someone just give me a definition? Because, we've been talking about, categories like white men and white women and degrees, and we've talked about this possessive investment in whiteness. Well, as Beatty and Leva say, whiteness is a foundational concept for racism. Whiteness creates an ideal race with which to devalue and subsequently oppress other racial groups. So in this vein, whiteness is an ideological construct, which means it's kind of like a belief or a philosophy that then guides actions. So even though it's a concept, it has very real consequences, particularly in mathematics.
So several scholars have spent time researching and talking about the intersections between whiteness and mathematics and STEM more broadly. So for example, Danny Martin, who was interviewed in the second framing reading for this presentation, argues that mathematics education is a white institutional space. And so what this means is that mathematics education functions to protect and is a product of whiteness. And so as Kristyn showed earlier, there is a possessive investment in mathematics education, which although it's related to economics, we would also argue that there's a possessive investment in whiteness that's also reflected in the large numbers of white people and the exclusion of people of color in STEM spaces, especially when we look at things like our curriculums or just act like physical numbers, the representations that Kristyn was talking about earlier. So these assertions that mathematics is neutral and objective have also been used to maintain whiteness as a status quo. Because again, the blame is taken away from the systems and structures that house and produce mathematics onto individuals. Dr. Rochelle Gutierrez builds on this and asserts that on many levels, mathematics itself operates as whiteness. Who gets credit for doing and developing mathematics, who is capable in mathematics, and who is seen as part of the mathematics community is generally viewed as white. So if we remember that one of the ways that imposterism manifests is by making individuals feel like imposters and by equating mathematics, membership in mathematics, and the history of mathematics with whiteness, how can we be surprised that so many people of color and women feel disenfranchised? And so throughout this presentation, Kristyn and I have repeatedly referenced how mathematics and imposterism are tied to institutions and structures. We have already spent time trying to show you how mathematics and STEM more broadly is connected to whiteness. Now I just want to spend a little bit more time talking about how imposterism is connected to anti-Black racism and white supremacy. So anti-Blackness is the disregard for Black institutions and policies. This disregard is the product of class, race, and/or gender privilege that certain individuals experience due to anti-Black institutions and policies. In terms of mathematics and STEM, anti-Black racism is part of a two-part system that strips Blackness of a value through overt forms of racism. And so this shows up when teachers or school counselors, either intentionally or unintentionally, fail to recommend or place students of color or women in higher level STEM courses. It also happens in research a lot when we see studies that simply divide participants by racial groups without considering the context. And Kristyn talked about this a little bit earlier when she talked about how sometimes research will just look at Asian communities as a monolith. Anti-Black racism also happens through overt racism, through different and harsher punishments, when different and harsher punishments are given to students of color. So just last week, a 15-year-old Black girl was jailed for not completing her schoolwork in the middle of a pandemic. And so studies have shown that Black students get harsher punishments for the same behavior as their white peers. And the fact that this occurs in STEM spaces shows us that math and STEM are microcosms of our larger society. Anti-Black racism also systematically marginalizes Black people through a covert racism. And so covert anti-Black racism includes implicitly assuming that Black and brown students or women are less capable in STEM. These implicit assumptions show up as like a teacher not calling on their Black and brown students or their female students as often as their white counterparts. Anti-Black racism is also tied to white supremacy. The two feed off each other. They are inter and codependent. And so white supremacy is a historically based, institutionally perpetuated system of exploitation and oppression of continents, nations, and people of color by white people and nations of the European continent for the purpose of maintaining and defending a system of wealth, power, and privilege. Earlier, Kristyn talked about how imposterism functions to consolidate power. So it's important to recognize that while power is usually consolidated about whiteness, one does not have to identify as being white to benefit from white supremacy. And white supremacy affects gender and racial groups differently. So one of the things that Kristyn and I often talk about is how we're positioned differently in mathematics spaces and in the broader context of society, because she's an Asian American woman and I'm a Black woman. But our oppressions and the way that we feel impostered by the system are connected because the way that we are positioned in these systems and our proximity to whiteness and Blackness. So for example, while I was often discounted because of my race in math, Kristyn often had to fight to be seen as an individual when her teachers only saw her racial identity and as a stereotypical good advanced Asian student in math. Lila Watson, an Aboriginal Australian artist and activist, reminds us that because anti-Black racism and white supremacy are tied together, our liberation and oppression are also tied together. And she states, if you came here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you came here because your liberation is bound with mine, then let us work together. And so we have to work on dismantling these systems.
Whew. That's a lot, right? That's a lot. So just to recap and to sort of distill what the main idea here is that these structural and institutional ties and foundations that Blake and I have been discussing for the last half hour frame and shape our conceptions and our stereotype of math people and who belong in STEM, and that then affects individual psyches and feelings of imposter syndrome or feeling impostered. Alrighty, so we know we just threw a lot at you, and at this point, you may be thinking like, okay, hold on. You said this isn't all in my head. Imposterism is part of these larger systems. Oh my gosh, like this is all getting so big. What can I even do anything? Like, what can we do to fix it? Oh my gosh. We know, it's a lot. And as a spoiler, a lot of the changes in navigating this are still going to have to rely on the individual who's experiencing imposter syndrome. For now. We're also hopeful that through the work of amazing critical scholars, teachers, and advocates that things are changing. And while we know that these structures like white supremacy can't be dismantled by any single person, personal agency is still very powerful in navigating some of these structural forces, and we certainly don't want to devalue the impact of that. So let's start to get into this question of how do we navigate imposterism?
And so one of the very first steps in navigating imposterism is just naming and knowing. So congratulations, you've already started on the first step. Naming and knowing involves validating your individual experiences and the ways that they manifest. And so we hope that we've shown you thus far that imposterism is just a natural reaction to macro and microaggressions that women and women of color experience in math and STEM spaces. But imposterism is just a symptom. In addition to naming and knowing how imposterism manifests at an individual level, we also need to name and know the structural and systemic causes. So I know for me, when I started naming the structural and systemic causes of my own imposterism, it gave me a confidence to combat it. So when I start feeling like imposter, I try to name the reasons that I might be feeling like an imposter. Is it because I feel isolated? Is there a lack of representation? Am I being reminded of other times that I've had to prove myself as a Black female mathematician? Is the institution unwelcoming of my diversity? Pinpointing the origin helps me to reframe my thoughts and devise ways to move forward. There is value in recognizing, sharing, and understanding our experiences as valid, knowing that you are not alone and that it's not all in your head. However, we must also name and recognize the structures that cause and support imposterism. As Delgado and Stefanik said, right, once named, it can be combated. So naming is a necessary first step. Like I said earlier, when I begin to feel imposterism, I try to engage in critical individual reflection. So while we know that imposterism is connected to larger societal, structural, and systemic issues, some of our effort does have to be in how we cope and navigate these systems. So first, we want to acknowledge and validate your thoughts. In other words, name your feelings of imposterism and know why and where they come from. Second, reframe your thoughts within the broader context and offer yourself self-compassion. It's very easy to feel like we're the purple circle, that what we know is eclipsed by what other people know, which leads to feelings of imposterism. But the truth is that what we know overlaps with what other people know. So the overlap between what we know and what other knows is one of the reasons that diversity in math and STEM is so necessary. While traditional conceptions of mathematics would have us believe that mathematicians work in isolation, the truth is that folks in STEM work collaboratively. So diversity of thought leads to innovation. The third thing that we can do in our critical individual reflection is to address negative stereotypes in the moment. So this can mean checking our own negative stereotypes or those of the people around us. We are social beings who have been socialized. So it makes sense that we may hold negative stereotypes. However, we should be mindful when we see ourselves drawing on negative stereotypes to guide our behaviors, our thoughts, and our actions. Grace Lee Boggs, who was a civil and labor rights activist, said, "Being a victim of oppression in the United States is not enough to make you a revolutionary. Just as dropping out of your mother's womb is not enough to make you human. People who are full of hate and anger against their oppressors, who only see us versus them, can make rebellion, but not a revolution. The oppressed internalize the values of the oppressor. Therefore, any group that achieves power, no matter how oppressed, is not going to act differently from their oppressors as long as they have not confronted the values that they have internalized and consciously adopted. This also means that sometimes individuals who are well-intentioned and individuals not so well-intentioned may express stereotypes. So in order to dismantle this system, we have to draw attention to the ways that other people reinforce them as well. Fourth, recognize your power and brilliance. I didn't get a chance to meet you this summer, but I don't have to meet you to know that you're capable of changing the world. You hold immense power, and people will be attracted to your light as you continue to show it to the world. And finally, find uplifting community. Kristyn is not just my colleague, she is my friend, my support system, and an integral part of my community. So when I feel like I don't belong, I know that I can turn to Kristyn to remind me of my power and my brilliance. And I hope that I do the same for her. She pushes me to be a better educator, researcher, and person. So find a community who does that for you, and also remember to do that for other people. Now we're going to turn to the ways that stakeholders can work towards changing the systems and institutions where mathematics and STEM is housed. First, offer critical feedback. Critical feedback lets students know that you are holding them to high standards and intentionally avoids attaching feedback to student identities. Feedback should focus on the task, how students have accomplished the task, and the ways that the task can be improved. Second, we must be strategic about increasing critical mass. Our goal should never be simply filling quotas. Our goal should be increasing diversity and fostering a culture of inclusion for students. Increasing the number of girls in STEM of color in a space without also expending energy and effort on how these spaces reproduce feelings of imposterism is like running a race with no finish line. There's no point. The goal in increasing critical mass is to improve members' trust, comfort, and performance in that setting. Third, we want to foster intergroup conversations. Allow students to learn from each other. Every student has value. Fourth, allow students to affirm their most valued sense of self. Allow and encourage students to show up as their most authentic selves. Talk to students and find out who they are, and this will help you to think about best practices and policies to support them. Fifth, we should allow students to develop and explain their narratives. Don't assume that you know how students feel or how they navigate math in STEM spaces. Validate how students feel, even if you haven't felt that way, and allow students to tell you how they feel in their words, and ask what they need of you. It's important for students of color and women to be heard. Without putting all the work on minoritized and marginalized students to change the culture of STEM spaces, invite them to collaborate and build with you. And finally, we have to recognize our own complicity. As I've stated earlier, socialization is normal and expected as we navigate the world. Each of us has a responsibility to critically reflect on the change and the ways in which we produce and reproduce imposterism. So author of The Body Is Not an Apology, Sonia Renee Taylor beautifully says, systems do not maintain themselves. Even our lack of intervention is an act of maintenance. Every structure is upheld in every society by the active and passive assistance of other human beings. I really like this quote because it reminds me that there's only two roads we can take. Either we're complicit or we're using our power to actively work towards making STEM and math more inclusive for everyone. And we hope that we've shown you that there's no in between.
So if we can leave you with at least one starting point action item today, I know this list is a little overwhelming. If we can leave you with one thing to start with today, whether you're a camper or you're just a friendly viewer tuning in, we really want to challenge you to start to think about how you define what a math person is and why you feel that way, and to begin towards work towards eliminating that phrase from your vocabulary. All right, so we just gave you a lot. We'd like to just briefly show our reference list and thank the folks that we have drawn upon, including our lovely presentation, which was created by Slidesco. And we just want to say thank you for tuning in, for listening, and for being a part of this with us today. You can find us on Twitter if you want to connect after this. And for the campers, we'll see you on Tuesday.
All right, thank you so much, Blake and Kristyn. Wow, that was really good, very informative, well-researched and composed. I want to thank you again and also thank all our students for tuning in. We'll see you in a few days, and everyone else who tuned in, thank you for joining this Saturday. Also like to remind, if you'd like to join our remaining public events, to please go to girlstalkmath.com and click on the 2020 Public Events link. And that's all we have for today. Thank you all and take care.